It's the engine room of the British economy. Construction in October hit a high not seen since records began in 2010, driving GDP back up.
So these cages are all built here on site, and they will go down to support the build of HS2.
This warehouse is brand new, and today is its first in operation. Here, they weld the steel that keeps our roads and rail tunnels standing, with concrete reinforcements for huge infrastructure projects. How does this year compare to other years?
So we've had our best year, we've doubled in size. The drivers for our business are around HS2 and rail. We're also heavily involved in smart motorways, also involved in the nuclear industry, so building new power stations, and in commercial housing within the UK.
It's one of the industries that's seen GDP driven back up. Official figures out today show the economy grew by 0.5% between September and October, beating expectation. Construction has now been growing for 4 months in a row, and the services sector, our largest, grew too. But the bigger picture isn't so bright. GDP fell by 0.3% in the 3 months to October compared with the 3 months before. So it's a mixed picture, better than expected, but October's growth outstrips that of September's, partly, the ONS says, because so many businesses closed around the Queen's funeral. All eyes will be on November and December's figures, because if they wipe out the growth that we've seen today, well, that's when we'll know whether or not we're officially in a recession that many economists say is likely.
Well, these figures confirm that this is a very challenging economic situation here and across the world, and it will get worse before it gets better. But we have a plan that will more than halve inflation over the next year, and if we stay the course, we can get back to the strong economic growth that we need.
Thank you very much.
Just a pound.
Thank you very much
Thank
indeed.
you
Thank
very
you.
much.
That's wonderful.
Okay.
Marvellous.
While GDP in October was on the rise, so too was inflation, hitting a 41-year high. Its effect on spending habits is marked in the accounts of this small printing shop.
Normally at this year we're mobbed out with work. There's a lot of work going on. I would say we're probably about a third down compared to normal years in the past. We are getting a lot of people saying that they're not buying as many presents this year for families, and they've told people they're not spending. But the streets are generally quieter. There's not as many people out on the street this year. I think it's going to be a struggle. I do think it's going to be a struggle. People are tightening the belts, so it's going to be hard on retail.
Christmas sales should give the economy a boost. But with an energy crisis and food prices on the rise, many are already spending more cautiously.
Every time you go into the shops, you can see everything going up. And as pensioners, you know, everything isn't going up on pensions. So you're just being more careful what you're spending now.
We have the heating on for 1.5 hours a day, that's all. And that's from 5 until 6:30 at night. All the rest of the time we've got layers on.
And if you think it's icy out here, relations between the unions and the government have reached a new low. The political cost of prolonged disruption looming large, while the economic cost of public and private sector strikes in the run-up to Christmas will be counted in the weeks ahead.
Well, the Health Secretary, Steve Barclay, is holding talks this evening with the Royal College of Nursing, although not crucially on pay, as the union prepares to hold the first strike in its history later this week. That is just one dispute in a long list of strikes planned on most days until the new year, as workers take industrial action across many parts of the economy. RMT rail workers walk out again tomorrow in the first of 4 more strike days this week. They'll also strike for 4 days over Christmas itself. Getting your Christmas cards on time will be harder, as Royal Mail staff strike for a further 4 days. The health service in England, Wales and Northern Ireland could be badly impacted too, as nurses strike for 2 days. They'll be joined by ambulance workers who walk out on 2 days either side of Christmas in England and Wales. Driving examiners are also staging rolling strikes in different parts of the country, while at Heathrow Airport, baggage handlers are walking out for 3 days, and Border Force staff are planning a series of strikes across the holiday season at airports and ports. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, is in Westminster for us now. Gary, if all of those happen, it's looking a bit like a general strike.
Yes, there is one area where there is a strike that has been
called off, strike action that's been called off, and that's by Unite and Unison members in Scotland working inside the NHS. The Royal College of Nursing staff in Scotland are still consulting on that, so there was an improved offer from the Scottish Government. The Scottish Government is making much of the fact that they feel they've shown flexibility, whereas the Westminster Government hasn't. Elsewhere, it does look as though that sort of advent calendar of strikes that you were just looking at is going ahead. There are talks at the moment. We think they started about 6 o'clock. People are being cagey about all of this between the Secretary of State for Health, Steve Barclay, and the Royal College of Nursing about whether strikes carry on in other parts of the United Kingdom. But as you were saying there, the government said they weren't going to discuss pay. The Royal College of Nursing said, well, we're not going to sit down unless you discuss pay. The meeting is happening with rumours swirling around that maybe the Royal College of Nursing will walk out if pay isn't discussed. So not great optics around that meeting, but it still seems to be going on. And train workers in the RMT have voted by a pretty hefty 64% margin to reject the pay offer there. So the national strike there seems to be going ahead. So, yeah, pretty much that picture is the one you just had up in the graphic.
And the government's calling in the army. What are they going to have to do?
Yes, there's something called MACAs, military aid to the civil authorities, requests that go in from domestic departments when they need military help. And they went in from Border Force and they went in from the NHS. And very specifically in the NHS, what we think 600 army personnel are going to be doing is potentially driving ambulances. Now, there are all sorts of rules around who can drive an ambulance and how they can drive it. And these military personnel will, although they'll be driving under a flashing blue light, will not be allowed to disobey red lights and speeding. So the expectation is very much that they will backfill less urgent ambulance journeys, leaving a few ambulance drivers, fully qualified ones, to do the emergency trips, and about 150 extra logistics people going in from the army there as well, and as I said, going into Border Force. The COBRA meeting that happened today, ministers sitting round the table from lots of different departments discussing these strikes, very much not trying to look at the ledger and can we squeeze a bit more out of the budget to help with pay offers for any of these disputes. It was very much sitting there looking at contingencies, looking at damage limitation, what can be done to make the pain for people of using public services and find there's virtually nothing there in some cases, or very depleted public services. What can be done to try and ameliorate that? That is the game that the government is involved in at the moment. It doesn't look at all, as your interview with the Chancellor showed, as though there's more money on the table.
Thanks, Gary. Well, I spoke to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Jeremy Hunt, earlier today, and I began by asking him about the strikes. Jeremy Hunt, you've prided yourself on being honest with people about the state of the public finances, how difficult things are. Are you prepared to be similarly honest with the nurses that you're the person standing in the way of government negotiations, and it's deliberate because you need people to have less money because that's good for bringing inflation down?
Well, the nurses and indeed the other public sector unions have a very sincerely held position. They are quite understandably very concerned about the erosion in their pay packets caused by high inflation. But we have to be careful not to take decisions that lock in that high inflation. And that's why the whole government is clear that our #1 priority is to bring down inflation. We have a plan to do that. The Office for Budget Responsibility say that our plan will bring down inflation to less than 4% by around this time next year, compared to 11% now. So we want to settle these disputes. We think the right way to do that is an independent process that takes into account the need not to lock in high inflation, but also understands people's genuinely held worries about the erosion of their pay packets.
I mean, because you say they have to take into account how much money there is. I mean, what you're saying to public sector workers, and it's not just nurses, obviously, is you need to have less, you need to take real terms pay cuts for the good of the economy.
Well, we are saying to everyone that if we gave an inflation-proof pay rise, the result would be that we would lock in high inflation for years to come, and we wouldn't just be having this discussion now, we'd be having it next year, the year after. And that's why we are faced with this very, very difficult decision.
Do you accept that they're ordinary people? You know, these are not left-wing miners trying to bring down Margaret Thatcher. These are hard-working, ordinary people who are just trying to make ends meet. Because the Prime Minister portrayed this as ordinary people against union bosses last week.
I do accept that people on the front line are working incredibly hard. Goodness me, didn't we see that in the pandemic when they did an absolutely brilliant job? And that's why I say their position is sincerely held, but we have to be really careful that we don't do anything that inadvertently makes the problem worse. And that's why this is such a difficult situation.
There are going to be over 8 million people living in fuel poverty by April. You're going to have to, that's despite everything you've done. You're going to have to give people more, aren't you?
Well, at the moment, if you look at the package that we've put on the table, we've said that we'll continue with the energy price guarantee for next year. That will bring around £500 off the average energy bills for families up and down the country. We will shortly announce a similar plan for businesses. I think we're doing a huge amount. We're also increasing payments to people on means-tested benefits by £900. And we're increasing the national living wage by a record amount. We're increasing pensions by inflation. So I think we're doing everything we possibly can to help people through very challenging times.
But I mean, there will still be millions of people living in fuel poverty. I mean, do you accept this sense that there is a real feeling at the moment of sort of Britain being broken? You can't get an appointment at the doctor's, your letters don't arrive, you can't get a train, you know, you're looking at fuel bills that you can't afford. And the government feels like it's running out of ideas. You know, Conservative MPs in reality TV shows and saying they're resigning. Have you given up as a government?
Well, absolutely not. And 1/3 of the world is predicted to be in recession either this year or next year, according to the International Monetary Fund. And we aren't immune to the impact of a global pandemic, to what Putin is doing in Ukraine. And everyone is having to deal with these problems. But we have a plan that will bring down inflation. We have a plan for economic growth, some of which I announced on Friday with respect to financial services, which is about 10% of our GDP. And if we stick to that plan, we will get through to the other side and we'll start to see the high economic growth and the increase in people's real wages that is what people want.
I mean, you do always rightly mention the war in Ukraine and the global shocks after the pandemic. Isn't it also honest to recognise the impact of Brexit on the British economy?
Well, Brexit is a change in our economic model, and we've always been very honest that there are downsides and upsides, but we are absolutely going to make sure that we take the decisions that mean that Brexit is a tremendous success and adds to our economic growth. And some of the things that I announced in the autumn statement, some of the things I announced on Friday, actually are things that would not have been possible if we'd stayed inside the European Union, and that therefore will help boost our economic growth.
Jeremy Hunt, thank you very much indeed. Well, the Shadow Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, is in Westminster now. So the Health Secretary is sitting down with the nurses this evening, tonight. What should he be saying to them? I don't want a number from you in terms of what he should offer, but should he be offering them more money and breaking out of the independent pay process?
Yeah, I think he should say, let's talk about pay and let's put that on the table alongside the other issues, terms and conditions, perhaps even the way that the independent pay review body process itself works. Because if he did that, then the Royal College of Nursing and Unison have been clear that they would suspend strike action this week, and they would also be prepared to compromise on some of the demands they've been making. Now, I think that's reasonable, and I think that to put patients through a wave of industrial action in the NHS against the backdrop we see of the longest waiting lists, the queues in A&E, the poor ambulance response times, I think that would be deeply unfair on patients. Also unfair on staff, I have to say, who feel their backs are against the wall, they're burned out, and they will lose, let's not forget, a day's pay for every day they're on strike.
And if the government doesn't, and the nurses go on strike, do you support them?
I think we only have the government to blame. I don't blame nurses at all. I don't blame the unions who've tried to compromise. I blame the government at this stage, and I think the public will too, because when you've got unions willing to suspend strike action simply to have a conversation about pay, I just think that is surely the lowest bar. Right. And I don't understand why Steve Barclay hasn't just embraced that offer so that we could suspend strikes.
So does this apply to all the public sector, or are the nurses a special case? I mean, do you think that in principle the government should be getting involved in all these disputes, including the rail workers, and trying to get a bit more money in terms of an offer on the table to resolve the disputes and stop the strikes?
I think the government's got to take a view that says, is there a deal to be done that can avert strike action? And it may be that some of those deals cast a longer term. It may be that they're not simply about pay, but could look at other terms and conditions.
But are some more deserving than others?
It doesn't feel like they're willing to engage at all. And I think that's what a lot of us are struggling to get our head around. We don't want to see strike action taking place this Christmas. It's going to cause untold misery for millions. Yeah. So negotiate. And if negotiations break down, well, that's something else. I actually think the public would say, all right, well, at least you tried. But to not even try, I don't think that's a serious
how long
position.
do you think the public's patience, obviously the people going on strike are members of the public, but the other members of the public, when you say you think they'll support the nurses, for example, right now, how long do you think the rest of the British public will support this incredible calendar of strike action across so many different public and private sector areas?
I honestly don't know, Christian, and I think, you know, and you said it there in your interview with Jeremy Hunt, and I think you really spoke for the way that people are really feeling at the moment. The country just feels broken. It does feel like nothing is working. And I think people are sick and tired of it.
But you could be on the wrong side of that, couldn't you? I mean, that's clearly what the government's trying to manoeuvre when the Prime Minister talks about ordinary families against union bosses. He's seeing Labour with the union bosses, isn't he?
Oh, there's no doubt they're trying to politic like crazy around this, and I think people can see through that too. I think
but he's right fundamentally, aren't you? I mean, you are the party of Labour, you're the party of the unions, you're funded by them. You are generally on their side.
We're absolutely proud to stand up for the interests of working people, sure. What we are trying to do, at a time when people, I think, are absolutely sick and to the back teeth of this government, is to talk about what a Labour government would do to make sure we're making promises that we know we can keep. And sometimes, by the way, we get criticised for not going further or for promising more. And the reason why we are cautious, and we absolutely wear that as a badge of pride, is because we want to go into the election knowing that every promise we make is a promise we can keep.
OK, well, in your own area, you've said it's not the funding model that's wrong with the health service, it's the model of care. What does that actually mean?
Yeah, I think that the NHS that's free at the point of use is the thing that we have got to defend. I think it's the most important principle that underpins the NHS. When I went through my own cancer treatment last year, it was the one thing I didn't have to worry about was the bill. But I share the public's anxiety about the long-term future of the NHS because of the enormous pressures it's under that we see today. And when you compare the NHS to other healthcare systems across leading economies, we actually spend more than most on hospitals, but we underinvest in primary care, mental health, community services. And what I want to do over a 10-year period is shift that balance around the system. So we do faster diagnosis, which means more effective and less expensive treatment. Because at the moment, not only do we diagnose too late, which means poorer patient outcomes, it ends up costing us more as well. Okay. So I'm looking really carefully, given how much the NHS consumes as a proportion of government spending, I want to make sure that every penny of that is well spent.
Let's go into more detail on that another time, but Wes Streeting, thank you very much.